So the Galaxy S24 is finally here, and much like the iPhone 15, Samsung has focused on improving and refining what already was a good phone with the S23. So in this video, we're going to compare the Galaxy S24 with the iPhone 15 to find out which one you should buy. So this comparison is going to be divided into 5 sections. So we'll talk about the displays, the specs, the cameras, the build, and ultimately talk about which one you should buy. So to kick things off, let's talk about the displays. So the S24 has a bigger 6.2-inch dynamic AMOLED display. So bear in mind that it's only a 0.1-inch difference, but the screen's bigger now and the bezels are even across, so you don't have that chin at the bottom. And the other difference is that the display is flatter as opposed to having a curve around because of the design change. Now you also get 120Hz refresh rate and a resolution of 2340 by 1080, giving you a pixel density of 416, whereas the iPhone 15 has a 6.1-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display with a resolution of 2556 by 1179, giving you a pixel density of 461, but the refresh rate is only 60 Hz, and this is where the Samsung has a better display overall. And you can definitely feel the difference when using a phone with a higher refresh rate. The iPhone 15 feels a bit slow and just a bit sluggish when even comparing to the iPhone 15 Pro, which has a 120Hz refresh rate display. It just doesn't feel warranted for a phone that is almost this expensive to have a 60Hz display. But moving on, you have to keep in mind that the iPhone 15 has a higher resolution and a higher pixel density compared to the S24, but where the S24 shines and where Samsung in general is better is the colors, the saturation, and just the vividness of the display, which generally makes the displays look better in person. So you have to keep that in mind, but overall, I feel that 60 Hz is something that holds the iPhone 15 back. But moving on to specs, the Galaxy S24 has a new Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 chip with the Adreno 750 GPU and an octa-core processor, whereas the iPhone 15 borrows the chip from its predecessor Pro model, which is the A16 Bionic, with the Apple GPU and a hexa-core processor. The iPhone 15 has 6 gigs of RAM compared to 8 on the S24, and both the phones start at 128 gig and go all the way up to 512, but you have to keep in mind that the S24 in the US is only available in 128 and 256, whereas here in Australia the base is 256 and you get 512 as well. But neither of the phones are expandable and you're limited to the storage you purchase. The S24 has a massive 4000 mAh battery compared to 3349 on the iPhone. Both the phones has fast charging and both the phone have IP68 water and dust resistant certification. The S24 has its good old trusted under-display fingerprint scanner, whereas the iPhone 15 still uses Face ID for authentication, which bear in mind has gotten a lot better than the previous generations. But now let's move on to the best part of the comparison, which is the cameras. Now the S24 and the iPhone 15 might look a lot similar on a spec sheet in terms of their camera capabilities, but there's something going on with the iPhone you have to keep in mind, which I'll get to in a second. Now the S24 has a 50 megapixel wide sensor, which it has retained from its predecessor, but now they're using AI for better image processing, whereas the iPhone 15 has a 48 megapixel wide sensor. Both the phones have a 12 megapixel ultra wide sensor, but this is where things get a bit interesting because the S24 has a 10 megapixel telephoto lens and the iPhone 15 also has a telephoto lens. But keep in mind there's no third camera or a third lens on the phone. Essentially, Apple is taking that 48 megapixel main sensor, cropping the image down, zooming it in, and giving you a 12 megapixel telephoto image, which I guess it's genius marketing or maybe a bit questionable in some sense, because Apple does claim that there's 3 camera functionality in the phone, and there is in some sense, but it essentially is image processing to give you that third camera and that third image, and there's no physical hardware, which makes it a bit interesting. Now the S24 can do 8K video up to 30 frames per second, whereas the iPhone's only limited to 4K at 60 FPS, even though the camera should be capable of 8K video. The S24 has 1080p slow motion up to 960 frames per second, whereas the iPhone has only 240 frames, and the S24 can do HDR10 plus video, which only the Pro iPhones can do and not the base iPhone 15. Now up the front, both the phones have the exact same setup, so they got a 12 megapixel wide sensor with 4K video up to 60 FPS. Now, in terms of cameras, it always comes down to image processing because that's what the real differentiator is. The iPhone 15 generally has, or the iPhone lineup for that matter, generally has better video processing compared to the Samsung or any other phone for that matter, and that's where they have that edge. But again, the spec sheet doesn't always tell the full story, and it always comes down to real world use. But now let's move on and talk about the build. And this is where the S24 is a bit different to its predecessor. So they have gone the iPhone way and made the phone a bit more squared off as opposed to that curved and rounded edges. So you have a flat back and a flat display, so it doesn't curve around like it did in the previous generation, giving you a better bezel up front and just a bigger display. At least it's 0.1 inch bigger, but it's a bigger display in the same form factor. And they also have some new colors. So the S24 has onyx black, marble gray, cobalt violet, and an amber yellow. And there's also some Samsung exclusive colors online. And S24 starts at $799, whereas the iPhone 15 comes in black, green, blue, yellow, and pink, and also starts at $799. So both the phones have the same price tag, and even though, again, they're very different phones in terms of their capabilities and their specs, they are the entry level for both Samsung and Apple. And it comes down to the main question, which one you should buy. Now, with every comparison video, I always pointed out that it depends on which ecosystem you're already in. So if you're in the Apple ecosystem and you're just looking for an upgrade, then the iPhone 15 is great value for money, minus that 60 Hz display. Whereas if you're using a Samsung ecosystem or you're in that Android ecosystem and you're just looking for an upgrade, then the S24 is a great value for money as well. Now, do keep in mind that if you're coming from previous generations, let's say you're coming from the S23 or the iPhone 14, these might not seem like big or massive upgrades because they're just refined versions of their predecessors. But if you have a phone that's an older generation than that, maybe an iPhone 12 or 13 or maybe an S21 or S22, then these are great phones to upgrade to. And Samsung and Apple both have improved a lot, even though they might be just small refinements and improvements. And it also comes down to the point that if you are getting into Apple from, let's say, Android, and you're just looking for a starting phone, then the iPhone 15 is the best one to get. And the same goes for the S24, because if you're coming from an iPhone and you want to move on to Android or Samsung and you're just looking to get a base variant phone, there's nothing better than the S24. It's a very well packed and a very well refined phone. And yeah, that is pretty much it. Now, if you guys enjoyed the video, give it a big thumbs up. Thanks again for watching and stay tuned for more. Until then, please like, comment, and subscribe. Peace.